ALEATORY podcast.
I want you to look down at your hands for a second and just imagine you're holding an object so completely mundane, so remarkably ordinary, that you probably wouldn't even think twice about throwing it in the recycling bin.
Right, something you wouldn't even give a second thought to.
Exactly. We're talking about something that costs like fractions of a penny to manufacture on an industrial scale. It's really nothing more than shaped aluminum or maybe curved glass filled with carbonated water, high fructose corn syrup, and, a proprietary blend of artificial flavorings.
A completely mass-produced consumer good, utterly devoid of any inherent life-saving value.
Yeah, exactly. But I want you to imagine that just outside your immediate field of vision, existing behind this massive, heavily fortified geographical barrier, there are millions upon millions of people who desperately, almost painfully, crave this exact object.
They don't just want it because they're thirsty either.
Well, no, not at all. They dream about it. They construct these elaborate cultural myths around it. They view this simple, sugary beverage as like a talisman, a physical distillation of a vibrant, colorful world they are strictly forbidden from entering.
And that creates a totally fascinating economic and psychological paradox, really, because the people who possess this overwhelming desire, the ones who would do almost anything for a taste of this forbidden world, they aren't destitute in the traditional sense.
Right, they have money.
Exactly. They hold physical currency in their pockets. They are citizens of a terrifying, sprawling global empire. I mean, a nation-state with the industrial capacity to launch human beings into the vacuum of space, right? And build weapons capable of turning entire continents into radioactive glass.
Which is just wild to think about.
It is, and yet the money they hold in their hands, printed by this colossal superpower, is treated as a complete hallucination by the rest of the planet. It's a phantom currency.
Because the moment a citizen tries to carry that money across a border, the international financial system just looks at it and essentially says, we do not recognize this.
Right. It fundamentally breaks our conventional understanding of how value actually works.
Totally. We walk around every single day operating under the assumption that the paper in our wallets or, the digital numbers on our banking apps have an inherent undeniable gravity. We think of money as a law of physics.
But it isn't. It's an incredibly fragile psychological agreement.
It's a shared illusion of trust. And when you look at a situation where half the globe just straight up refuses to participate in that specific illusion, you're suddenly left with a population holding millions of intricately printed, mathematically useless pieces of paper.
So you have this staggering, continent-sized reservoir of human desire on one side.
Yeah.
And a corporation sitting on an ocean of cheap, sugary syrup on the other. But the bridge between them is structurally non-existent.
Which forces you into a position where the modern financial scaffolding we rely on, exchange rates, fiat currency conversions, international banking transfers, it just completely evaporates.
It strips away centuries of financial evolution.
Yeah, and violently returns us to the raw, ancient, almost primitive mechanics of barter. But we're not talking about trading like a bushel of wheat for a flock of sheep here.
No, we're talking about barter conducted on a scale so massive, so geopolitically fraught, that it involves the collision of basic human psychology, cutthroat corporate ambition, and the decaying, rusting hardware of mutual assured destruction.
Welcome to the episode. Together, we turn knowledge into real results. Today, you and I are exploring one of the most surreal, genuinely hallucinatory logistical anomalies of the 20th century.
It really is unbelievable.
It is. We have a dense stack of historical records in front of us today, ranging from the archives of the Barents Observer to incredibly granular academic theses on Soviet consumerism.
We've also got naval gazettes and some fantastic investigative reports from Elle magazine.
Right. And our mission today is to trace the physical and economic mechanics of how a carbonated beverage basically bypassed the nuclear anxieties of the Cold War, and how a single American corporation found itself attempting to navigate the sudden, violent collapse of a global empire.
To map the architecture of this anomaly, though, we can't simply start with the massive cargo ships or the infamous military hardware. We have to rewind to the origin point of the desire itself.
Which means we need to place ourselves in the summer of 1959.
Right, 1959. The geographic location is Sokolniki Park in Moscow, at the site of the American National Exhibition. Now, on paper, if you look at the diplomatic briefings from the time, this was ostensibly framed as a cultural exchange.
Oh, sure, cultural exchange.
Exactly. The United States and the Soviet Union had agreed to host reciprocal exhibitions in each other's countries. The stated goal was to promote mutual understanding and ease geopolitical tensions. But anyone actually paying attention understood that this was a theater of war.
He was just completely devoid of conventional munitions.
Precisely. It was an ideological battleground constructed entirely out of consumer goods.
And the logistical effort the Americans put into this exhibition was just staggering. I mean, they didn't just bring over a few pamphlets and posters. They literally shipped and constructed an entire full-scale model of a typical American suburban home right in the middle of Moscow.
And to make sure the Soviet crowds could see every single detail of this supposed capitalist utopia, they physically cut the house in half.
Yeah, creating this massive cross-section so thousands of people could just shuffle past and stare into the living rooms and bedrooms.
And they packed this house with the absolute bleeding edge of labor-saving devices. Washing machines, robotic floor sweepers, and, most crucially, a state-of-the-art General Electric model kitchen.
The underlying psychological warfare there was brilliant. The message wasn't about military superiority at all. It was far more insidious.
It was a message that basically said, look at how soft, how easy, and how incredibly prosperous our daily lives are while you stand in line for bread.
Ouch. Yeah. And that specific GE model kitchen becomes the stage for what history remembers as the kitchen debate.
Right, so you have Vice President Richard Nixon and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev locked in this incredibly tight, physically claustrophobic space.
Surrounded by a suffocating crush of journalists.
Breathless interpreters, the relentless heat of camera flashes.
Yeah.
And they engage in this impromptu, highly aggressive, completely unscripted ideological sparring match.
And Khrushchev was not a man to back down. He was entirely dismissive of the American display. He went out of his way to openly mock the gadgets.
He picked up a handheld lemon juicer,
Right.
looked at it with sheer disdain, and essentially asked Nixon if the American people were so lazy that they had machines to chew their food for them as well.
Wow.
He was posturing, making this grand sweeping claim that the Soviet Union, a nation that had only existed for 4 decades at that point, would eclipse the United States in technological and economic innovation within 7 short years.
I always find Khrushchev's exact phrasing there so chilling. He looked right at Nixon and said, "We will wave at you as we pass you by."
It's a heavy line. The ambient tension in that room must have been utterly paralyzing for everyone watching.
Nixon is trying desperately to maintain a diplomatic equilibrium, arguing that the competition between these two heavily armed nations should remain strictly technological and economic, avoiding the military domain entirely.
But while this monumental clash of nuclear titans is happening in front of the cameras, there is a secondary, much quieter, and arguably far more consequential drama unfolding on the periphery of the exhibition.
Right, and this is where we need to introduce Donald Kendall. At this precise moment in 1959, Kendall is a 30-something executive tasked with heading up the international division of PepsiCo.
And to put it bluntly, Kendall is staring down the barrel of corporate ruin.
His internal political situation back in the United States was incredibly precarious. Kendall had essentially bet his entire career trajectory on this Moscow exhibition.
He had fought a brutal internal battle against his own superiors, aggressively pushing to secure the funding to set up a Pepsi kiosk in Sokolniki Park.
You really have to understand the corporate mindset of the late 1950s here. Coca-Cola, Pepsi's massive, dominant rival, had looked at the Soviet Union, analyzed the political climate, and formally declined to participate.
They viewed the communist bloc as a total void, a lost cause where no American product could ever take root.
And Kendall's bosses shared that exact sentiment. They believed he was incinerating corporate capital on a fool's errand, attempting to sell the ultimate symbol of American capitalism in the literal heart of the communist world.
So the night before this exhibition officially opens to the public and the dignitaries, Kendall's in a state of absolute panic.
He knows that if he comes back to New York without a massive, undeniable public relations victory, his career is just over. The board of directors will crucify him for the expense.
So he executes a maneuver of sheer desperation. He physically goes to the American embassy, tracks down Richard Nixon, whom he had strategically cultivated a personal and political friendship with over the years, and he corners him.
He doesn't ask for a favor. He begs for his corporate life. He tells Nixon, I need to get a Pepsi into Khrushchev's hand or I am ruined.
Keen physical photographic evidence to justify the exorbitant cost of this trip to his executives back home.
And Nixon, acting as the ultimate political broker, actually delivers on this plea. During the chaotic, sprawling tour of the exhibition grounds, Nixon purposefully and specifically guides Khrushchev's massive entourage directly toward the Pepsi kiosk.
And we often view this in retrospect as a charming historical anecdote, a clever marketing stunt. But I think we need to critically interrogate the geopolitical weight of this specific interaction.
Absolutely.
Why did a photograph of a Soviet dictator sipping a paper cup of carbonated sugar matter so much? What are the actual hidden implications of that image beyond the immediate PR value for a beverage company?
Well, I would argue it mattered because it fundamentally pierced the veil of Soviet state propaganda.
How so?
For decades, the Soviet citizenry had been subjected to a relentless, ubiquitous narrative detailing the inevitable decay, the moral rot, and the sheer toxicity of the capitalist West.
Right.
And suddenly, in a single flash of a camera, there is their supreme leader, the man who just promised to bury capitalism publicly and visibly, enjoying the most iconic, saccharine symbol of that exact enemy. It broke the ideological quarantine.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But Kendall didn't just hand him a single cup and hope for the best, right?
Yeah.
He was operating on a level of psychological manipulation that basically borders on genius.
Oh, he was incredibly shrewd. Kendall didn't offer one cup, he offered two. He had intentionally set up a comparison.
Okay, so what was in the two cups?
One cup contained Pepsi that had been manufactured and bottled in the United States and shipped over. The other cup contained Pepsi syrup that had been mixed on-site right there at the kiosk using local Moscow water. And Kendall explicitly asks Khrushchev to taste both and declare which one is superior.
Wow. Now, Khrushchev is a politician, deeply entrenched in his own nationalistic pride, standing in front of the global press. Of course, he is going to loudly and bombastically declare that the Pepsi made with Russian water is vastly superior to the American product.
Exactly. He even starts grabbing cups and handing them out to his inner circle, demanding they taste the triumphs of the Soviet water formulation.
It is a phenomenal trap, and Khrushchev walked right into it. Kendall allowed the Soviet premier to claim this bizarre, completely manufactured victory over the chemical formulation of the soda.
While Kendall simultaneously secured what is arguably the greatest, most consequential product endorsement in the history of modern commerce.
To truly conceptualize the impact of this moment, we should look at it through the lens of physics.
Physics, okay, I'm listening.
Prior to this interaction, the Cold War dynamic was essentially a state of immense, terrifying potential energy. You have this massive, isolated population, hundreds of millions of people locked behind the Iron Curtain, existing in a vacuum, completely sealed off from the relentless machinery of the global consumer market.
Right, lots of tension, no release.
Exactly. Kendall's 2 cups of Pepsi acted as the chemical catalyst. It was the spark that triggered an unimaginable kinetic release of consumer desire.
Oh, that's a great way to frame it.
He did not merely introduce a beverage to a new demographic. He introduced a tangible, desirable, ingestible piece of the West. He proved physically that the impenetrable barrier was, in fact, permeable.
And on a micro level, it worked flawlessly for Kendall's survival. That photograph of Khrushchev drinking Pepsi goes viral across the globe. It runs in every major newspaper.
Kendall returns to New York not as a failure, but as a conquering corporate hero.
The internal doubts just vanish, and his career skyrockets. Within a few short years, he is elevated to the position of CEO of PepsiCo.
But here's where the narrative usually skips forward, and where we need to really slow down. Turning a brilliant photo op into a functioning industrial-scale business model took over a decade of agonizing negotiation.
Yeah, it wasn't until 1972 that the actual structural breakthrough occurred. By this point, the world has shifted. Richard Nixon is now the President of the United States.
And his old friend Donald Kendall is running the entire Pepsi empire.
And this is precisely where Pepsi collides headfirst with the fundamental structural flaw of the Soviet command economy. In 1972, Pepsi achieves the impossible. They secure a historic, unprecedented monopoly.
The Soviet government grants them the exclusive right to produce and sell cola within the borders of the USSR, completely locking out Coca-Cola.
It's the ultimate corporate victory lap. They have access to a completely untapped market of hundreds of millions of thirsty citizens. But there is a fatal, seemingly insurmountable logistical nightmare embedded in the contract.
The ruble.
The Soviet ruble is a soft currency.
Which means it is effectively monopoly money the second it crosses the Soviet border. The entire exchange rate was artificially controlled by the state, and the currency itself wasn't backed by any commodity or mechanism that the international financial markets recognized.
If you're a Soviet citizen, the ruble works perfectly fine to buy bread or a train ticket in Moscow. But if you're an American corporation, you cannot take a suitcase full of Soviet rubles to a bank in Manhattan or London and ask them to convert it into US
The
dollars.
global banks will literally laugh you out of the lobby.
Exactly. So Pepsi is staring at this incredible monopoly. They are generating massive sales volume inside the country, but they have absolutely zero mechanism to extract their profits.
You can't pay your American workers, buy American advertising, or pay dividends to your Wall Street shareholders in soft rubles.
This is where the sheer ingenuity of corporate survival forces an evolutionary leap in logistics. If the modern system of fiat currency fails you, you have no choice but to revert to the oldest system of trade known to humanity, barter. But you have to scale it up to an industrial transcontinental level. They devised a system of liquid barter that was breathtaking in its simplicity and terrifying in its logistical complexity.
So how did the mechanism actually work?
It worked like this. Pepsi would manufacture its highly guarded, proprietary concentrated syrup in the West. They would ship massive quantities of the syrup into the Soviet Union.
Okay.
The Soviets would then use their own infrastructure to dilute it, bottle it, and sell it internally to their population. In exchange, to settle the massive debt for that syrup, the Soviet government granted Pepsi the exclusive rights to import, market, and distribute Stolichnaya vodka within the United States.
Think about the physical realities of that supply chain for a second. Millions of gallons of dark, sweet Pepsi syrup flowing east across the Atlantic, and millions of gallons of clear, high-proof Stolichnaya vodka flowing west.
Pepsi literally had to restructure its entire corporate identity to make this work. They're a soft drink company. But to monetize their Soviet monopoly, they had to acquire an entirely separate importing firm, Monsieur Henri Wines.
Just to navigate the labyrinth of customs, liquor licenses, and distribution logistics required to flood the American market with Russian liquor.
It was an astonishing, incredibly fragile workaround. But I look at the sheer audacity of this entire operation, and I have to admit, I am struck by the absolute brilliance of Kendall's vision.
Really?
Yeah, he completely circumvented the geopolitical deadlock of two nuclear-armed superpowers, bypassing international finance entirely just to ensure his soda reached the consumer.
I think we need to carefully and critically scrutinize that admiration,
Yeah.
honestly. It is easy to romanticize this as a triumph of corporate logistics, but we must ask the uncomfortable question. Was Donald Kendall truly just acting as a savvy, innovative CEO, or had he crossed a dangerous threshold into acting like a rogue nation-state?
A rogue nation-state, isn't that a bit strong?
Not when you consider the terrifying level of political coordination required to execute this liquid barter. Kendall wasn't just sitting in a boardroom negotiating a standard trade deal. He was actively leveraging his deep personal friendship with the sitting president of the United States.
Well, sure, Nixon helped him.
He wasn't just dealing with Soviet trade ministers. He had Henry Kissinger and Alexander Haig, the highest echelons of the American national security apparatus, actively lobbying the Soviet ambassador in Washington on Pepsi's behalf.
Wait, are you suggesting that the United States government intentionally compromised its own diplomatic neutrality to serve as the private enforcement arm for a publicly traded soft drink company?
I am stating that the historical record strongly indicates exactly that. We frequently dress these interactions up in the polite, sanitized language of soft diplomacy or cultural exchange. Kendall himself repeatedly went on record claiming he was building bridges of peace between hostile nations through commerce.
But you don't buy that.
Let's dissect the reality of that claim. This was not a humanitarian peace mission. This was raw, unfiltered, aggressive capitalist ambition utilizing the highest offices of the American government to secure a lucrative corporate monopoly.
That's a huge accusation.
When the National Security Advisor of the United States is pushing a specific corporate contract as an instrument of foreign policy, you have a staggering, profoundly dangerous conflict of interest. It fundamentally blurs the line between sovereign statecraft and corporate strategy.
I understand the ethical friction there, definitely. But you cannot deny the mechanical success of the operation. Regardless of how the sausage was made in the halls of Washington, the actual machinery of the barter worked beautifully for years.
It did function, yes.
Millions of gallons of syrup exchanged for millions of gallons of vodka. It was a perfectly balanced, albeit bizarre, economic equation.
Right.
But the problem with relying on geopolitical stability for your corporate profits is that geopolitics is inherently unstable.
Exactly.
The math works perfectly right up until the moment it doesn't, and that breaking point arrives violently in 1979. So let's take a quick second to synthesize what we just unpacked for you. We've moved from a frantic PR stunt in a 1950s model kitchen to an industrial-scale, state-sponsored liquid barter of syrup for vodka in the 1970s. But now we hit a massive wall.
The geopolitical reality fundamentally alters the equation. In December of 1979, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan.
And the international backlash is immediate, sweeping, and severe.
And within the United States, this anger manifests as a total grassroots consumer boycott of all Soviet goods.
And what was the single most visible, easily identifiable, and therefore most easily boycotted Soviet product on American shelves?
Stolichnaya vodka.
Exactly. Practically overnight, the entire American market for Stoli evaporates. I mean, liquor store owners are physically pouring the bottles down the drain in the streets for local news cameras.
Wow.
The exact mechanism that Pepsi relied upon to extract their profits, the only way they could turn their syrup into hard currency, is completely and totally destroyed by a war thousands of miles away.
Meanwhile, inside the closed ecosystem of the Soviet Union, the situation is moving in the exact opposite direction. The domestic demand for Pepsi has reached an absolute fever pitch.
How big are we talking?
We are looking at a domestic population that is now consuming roughly 1 billion servings of Pepsi every single year.
1 billion?
1 billion. The Soviet state treasury has become deeply structurally dependent on the massive ruble revenues generated from those domestic sales. Furthermore, the Soviet leadership is terrified.
Of what? Losing the soda?
They are acutely aware of the simmering civilian discontent, and they are terrified of the potential for mass civil unrest if this beloved, highly visible symbol of daily normalcy suddenly disappears from the grocery store shelves.
So it creates a terrifying high-stakes standoff. I mean, put yourself in Pepsi's boardroom. You are sitting on a literal mountain of Soviet rubles that you cannot convert into dollars.
Right.
You possess millions of bottles of Russian vodka sitting in American warehouses that you absolutely cannot sell because of a national boycott. And yet the Soviet government is demanding that the syrup must keep flowing.
The tension must have been unbearable.
How on earth does a publicly traded corporation act as an international debt collector against a crumbling, heavily militarized superpower? What is the protocol when the Soviet Union looks at you and says, "We have no hard currency, your vodka is worthless, but if you stop sending the syrup, we will nationalize your factories and your monopoly is over"?
This incredible tension brings us to the spring of 1989 and the birth of what is perhaps the most enduring, most stubbornly persistent, and most wildly misunderstood internet myth of the late 20th century.
Oh, I know exactly where you're going with this.
The Soviet Union, completely devoid of hard currency, ostracized by the international community, and desperate to keep the Pepsi taps open to placate their citizens, offers to pay their astronomical soda tab using the only asset they still possess in massive abundance: military hardware.
Right. The infamous 1989 naval deal, the story that everyone has seen shared 1,000 times online. The Soviets hand over an absolute armada to settle their syrup debt.
Here we go.
We are talking about 17 diesel-electric attack submarines. Specifically, the Project 613 or Whiskey class subs, plus a cruiser, a frigate, and a destroyer.
Yep, that's the list.
The internet loves to claim that in a single stroke of a pen, a soda company acquired a fleet so massive that Pepsi instantly became the 6th largest navy in the entire world.
And that specific claim is where we have to aggressively intervene and completely dismantle the fiction.
Break it down for us.
The idea that Pepsi became the 6th largest navy is a grotesque distortion of reality. Let's look at the actual granular mechanics of this transaction. First of all, let's address the operational capacity. Did Pepsi suddenly assume the payroll for thousands of highly trained Soviet naval engineers and combat sailors?
Well, no, obviously not.
Right. Did these vessels arrive fully armed, loaded with active torpedoes, munitions, and highly classified naval encryption codes?
No, the historical records clearly show they were entirely disarmed and stripped of any classified tech before the transfer.
Precisely. Furthermore, consider the legal and logistical impossibilities. How does a corporate entity, headquartered in the affluent suburbs of Purchase, New York, legally take physical delivery of a fleet of foreign warships. Do they sail them up the Hudson River?
That would be a sight.
They don't. The reality of the 1989 deal is far less glamorous than the myth, but it is actually far more indicative of the terminal desperation of the Soviet state. This was not a military transfer, it was a scrap metal pipeline.
So they were just junk.
These ships were not an operational projection of power. They were rusting, completely obsolete, critically unseaworthy husks that had been sitting idle in the freezing, corrosive waters of the Baltic Sea for years, slowly rotting away.
So the idea that Pepsi executives were sitting around a boardroom table plotting to patrol the high seas with giant red, white, and blue logos painted on the conning towers of attack submarines is purely a fantasy.
It is entirely fantasy. Pepsi acted purely as a financial middleman to extract value from dead assets. They accepted the physical titles to these vessels on paper and almost immediately transferred those titles to a commercial shipyard in Norway.
Okay, so what did the shipyard do with them?
The submarines were physically towed across the ocean to Norway, where they were methodically cut apart with industrial blowtorches. The high-grade steel was melted down and sold on the international commodities market by the ton.
Oh, wow.
And the revenue generated from that scrap metal, which amounted to a remarkably paltry $150,000 per submarine, was then routed back through international banks to Pepsi to finally pay off the accumulated syrup debt.
When you break it down like that, $150,000 for an attack submarine is a brutally depressing metric of imperial decline.
It is the economics of scavenging. Think of it in terms of marine biology, specifically a whale fall in the deep ocean.
A whale fall?
Yeah. When a massive leviathan dies and its carcass sinks into the abyssal zone, its enormous decaying structure is immediately set upon by thousands of smaller, highly opportunistic organisms.
Oh, I see.
The Soviet military-industrial apparatus was the dying whale.
Yeah.
Western corporations and Norwegian scrapyards were the organisms, systematically stripping the carcass down to the bone to extract whatever residual caloric value remained.
That's a brilliant analogy.
To claim that Pepsi possessed a navy simply because they held the paperwork for scrap metal is like saying Ernest Cox, the British salvage expert who bought the scuttled German high seas fleet out of the mud of Scapa Flow after World War I just to sell the steel, was a grand admiral. Owning millions of pounds of floating junk does not confer military power.
I completely agree with the dismantling of the myth, but we also have to acknowledge that the pure optical absurdity of the situation was completely undeniable, even at the time. Donald Kendall himself recognized the surreal nature of what he was doing, and he leaned into the joke. He famously quipped to Brent Scowcroft, who was serving as the national security advisor to President George H.W. Bush at the time. He said, "We're disarming the Soviet Union faster than you are."
It is a phenomenal, deeply cynical quote. And we must pause the narrative timeline here to let the sheer, surreal weight of that reality fully sink in.
Yeah, it's wild.
The Cold War, a multi-generational ideological conflict that defined global anxiety, dictated foreign policy, and threatened human extinction for half a century, was not ending in a fiery, apocalyptic nuclear exchange.
All right.
It was ending with an American corporate executive acting as a glorified scrap metal dealer, systematically melting down the terrifying instruments of Armageddon for pennies on the dollar, just to finance the delivery of carbonated sugar water.
It is the ultimate, inescapable victory of capitalism, distilled into a single, utterly absurd transaction. But the story of Pepsi and the dying empire doesn't end in the Norwegian scrapyards.
No, it doesn't.
Because scrap submarines were merely a temporary stopgap measure. By 1990, the situation escalates to a level of financial complexity that makes the submarine deal look like child's play.
How so?
Pepsi executives realize that acting as a scrap dealer isn't a sustainable growth model. They need a permanent solution. So they negotiate an absolutely staggering, historically unprecedented $3 billion follow-up contract with the Soviet state.
And this 1990 contract is where the corporate ambition truly metastasizes into something profoundly dangerous.
You think so?
Absolutely. This deal was intended to completely double Pepsi's massive footprint within the USSR. They laid out plans to build 26 brand-new state-of-the-art bottling plants, bringing their total operational capacity to 50 facilities across the country.
That's a massive capital expenditure.
But far more significantly, they were introducing an entirely new variable into the Soviet market, Pizza Hut.
Pizza Hut.
They were bringing American fast food to Moscow. And they structured the Pizza Hut operation with profound, almost cynical ingenuity.
How did they set it up?
They opened 2 distinct Pizza Hut locations, side by side. One restaurant accepted standard Soviet rubles, which allowed them to cover their local operational costs, paying the Russian staff, buying local produce, keeping the lights on.
Makes sense.
But the second restaurant right next door only accepted hard foreign currency. It was designed exclusively for tourists, diplomats, and the Soviet elite who had access to dollars or pounds. That second restaurant was the one that generated actual repatriable profit for the corporation.
The dual currency restaurant model is a logistical masterstroke. It solves the local overhead problem while still extracting hard capital.
Yes.
But we have to ask the multi-billion-dollar question. How were the Soviets actually paying for this massive $3 billion infrastructure expansion? Because 17 rusting submarines certainly do not cover a $3 billion invoice.
The new payment mechanism they engineered was exponentially more complex than towing dead submarines to Norway. The Soviet Union agreed to utilize their massive active commercial shipyards. Instead of building warships, the Soviets would build 10 massive state-of-the-art commercial oil tankers for Pepsi.
Wait, oil tankers?
Yes. We are talking about colossal vessels ranging from 28,000 to 65,000 tons of displacement. The arrangement was that Pepsi would take legal ownership of these newly constructed tankers, and then Pepsi would lease them out on the international commercial shipping market.
Oh, I see.
The hard currency generated from leasing these ships to global oil companies would then be funneled back to finance their Soviet expansion.
I look at that 1990 agreement, and honestly, I see a corporation executing a flawless, multi-tiered logistical miracle. They looked at a closed economy, found its only remaining functional asset-heavy industrial shipbuilding capacity, and figured out a mechanism to translate that heavy industry into liquid global capital.
And I look at that exact same agreement and see a corporation playing a highly dangerous, fundamentally reckless game of geopolitical financial roulette.
Roulette, why?
Think about the fragility of the structure they have built. By 1990, Pepsi was no longer operating as a beverage company. They were simultaneously acting as a global merchant bank, an international shipping magnate, a heavy industrial contractor, and a scrap metal dealer.
When you list it all out like that, it does sound a bit overextended.
All of this immense, incredibly precarious logistical scaffolding was erected for one single purpose: to sell a beverage that costs pennies to manufacture. They were assuming an astronomical level of sovereign risk. They were betting their entire $3 billion corporate future on the enduring stability of the Soviet government.
A government that, unbeknownst to the Pepsi executives, the CIA, and the Soviet citizens themselves, had only a matter of months left to live.
Precisely. Which brings us to the catastrophic tipping point, 1991, the fall of the empire.
Yeah.
The Soviet Union does not experience a slow, managed decline. It violently shatters. The central authority in Moscow evaporates, and the colossal state disintegrates almost overnight into 15 newly independent sovereign nations.
I want you to imagine the sheer, unadulterated panic inside the Pepsi boardrooms in New York when the news broke. You have spent 3 decades meticulously building this incredibly delicate, highly integrated, multi-billion-dollar barter machine that relies entirely on a centralized command economy.
And suddenly, the earth opens up and swallows your entire operating environment whole.
This isn't just a bad quarter. This is a premium narrative thriller playing out in real-time corporate panic.
The new geographic reality of the collapse instantly turned Pepsi's supply chain into a living, breathing nightmare. Under the Soviet system, the USSR was one massive, seamless, internally frictionless market. A train could travel from Kiev to Vladivostok without ever stopping for customs.
Right.
But suddenly, hard national borders snap into existence where absolutely none existed yesterday. The factory producing the specific plastic resin required for their bottles is suddenly located in the newly independent sovereign nation of Belarus.
The dairy farms supplying the mozzarella cheese for the Pizza Huts and the factories producing the glass for the bottles are suddenly trapped behind international borders in Lithuania. Meanwhile, the corporate headquarters, the massive bottling plants, and the primary consumer base remain stranded in Russia.
But the most devastating, fatal blow of all was the location of the shipyards.
Oh, no. The oil tankers.
Yes. The massive industrial shipyards that were currently halfway through constructing the lucrative commercial oil tankers, the exact ships that were supposed to finance the entire $3 billion expansion, were physically located in the newly sovereign state of Ukraine.
And the newly formed Ukrainian government looks at this massive shipbuilding contract, a contract that was signed by deposed officials of a dead Soviet state back in Moscow, and they simply shake their heads.
They weren't going to just hand over the shipyards because of some old treaty.
Exactly. They say, we do not recognize this agreement. This is our shipyard now. They physically seize the shipyards. They hijack the partially built tankers, and they tell Pepsi, if you want these ships finished, you need to pay us in actual hard American cash.
It is the logistical equivalent of a severe psychological breakdown. It is a total schizophrenia of the supply chain.
Schizophrenia.
Yeah. The right hand suddenly demands an international passport, an export visa, and a briefcase full of hard U.S. dollars just to hand a piece of glass to the left hand. The entire liquid barter system, which relied implicitly on the absolute unquestioned authority of a centralized command economy to force the different regions to cooperate, instantly vaporized in the face of decentralized nationalist chaos.
And while Pepsi's top executives are frantically flying from Kyiv to Minsk to Vilnius, desperately trying to bribe local border guards, renegotiate contracts with newly minted regional warlords, and just figure out how to get their cheese delivered to Moscow, Coca-Cola is watching from the sidelines.
And Coke executes a flawless, utterly devastating corporate counterattack.
Coca-Cola swept into the ruins of the Soviet market with an overwhelming advantage that Pepsi could never match. They were completely unburdened by the past.
Coke didn't have complicated, decades-old barter deals tying them to obsolete shipyards or crumbling Soviet infrastructure. They didn't have mountains of worthless rubles.
Coke brought hard American dollars. They moved incredibly fast, building fresh, modern factories from the ground up. They flooded the newly independent television networks with slick, aggressive, modern Western advertising. They literally painted the streets and kiosks of Moscow red.
Pepsi had inadvertently become a victim of its own longevity. Because they had been the only cola available for 20 years, they had become inextricably associated with the gray, stagnant, oppressive era of Leonid Brezhnev.
Pepsi was the drink of the old regime.
Exactly. Coca-Cola brilliantly positioned itself as the exact opposite. The taste of the new, wild, dangerous, exhilarating freedom of the 1990s.
In a matter of a few short years, Pepsi's decades-long, hard-fought monopoly was completely shattered. They survived the collapse, yes, but they were never the undisputed kings of the East again.
This profound historical pivot forces us to confront the physical remnants of this era. What is actually left of this colossal clash of ideologies today?
Good question.
To understand the legacy, let's look at a modern echo of this story, specifically detailed in the recent reporting by the Barents Observer. Consider the giant Typhoon-class submarines.
The big ones.
These were the absolute pinnacle of Soviet naval engineering, the terrifying successors to the rusted whiskey-class boats Pepsi scrapped. Specifically, the Dmitry Donskoy. Displacing 48,000 tons, it is the largest submarine ever constructed in human history.
It is an unimaginably massive, terrifying machine designed explicitly to hide in the deep ocean and end the world upon receiving a single launch code. And what is the Russian government doing with it right now?
The current Russian government is planning to spend tens of billions of rubles, an astronomical sum of money, not to refit the Donskoy for modern warfare, but to completely gut its highly radioactive nuclear reactors, strip out its missile tubes, and turn this Cold War Leviathan into a static museum piece in St. Petersburg.
There is a quote from the Barents Observer article from a man named Alexander Nikitin. He is a former Soviet submarine officer and an exiled nuclear safety expert, and his assessment captures the profound tragedy of this perfectly.
What did he say?
He said that spending billions to turn the Donskoy into a museum is like creating a monument about no one and nothing. A pile of scrap metal for a country which no longer exists.
It resonates with a deep, almost melancholic, poetic tragedy. You look at the Donskoy and you see the terrifying gigantism of Soviet hard power, these massive, incredibly expensive titanium hulls built to project dominance and fear across the globe.
Yeah.
Yet in the end, they are completely immobilized, hollowed out, and reduced to tourist attractions. It stands in absolute stark contrast to the total, invisible, insidious victory of Western soft power.
Which brings us to the grand synthesis of everything we've unpacked today. When you step back and connect all these bizarre historical dots, from the model American kitchen in Sokolniki Park to the massive shipments of Stolichnaya vodka to the scrap submarines in Norway and the hijacked oil tankers in Ukraine, a single unifying theory emerges.
The fall of the Soviet Union wasn't ultimately brought about by the threat of nuclear missiles. It wasn't decided by grand philosophical debates between serious statesmen in suits.
No, it was dismantled from the inside out by the relentless, microscopic, everyday human desire for a normal life. It was completely undone by the craving for a bright blue and red can of sugary fizz.
Money, as we established in the very first minutes of our conversation, is simply a shared illusion of trust.
When a government, no matter how heavily armed, can no longer satisfy the basic, fundamental desires of its people, and when its currency entirely loses the trust of the global community, no amount of titanium submarines, no amount of aggressive military posturing can save it from internal collapse.
In the end, the ultimate, most devastating weapon of the 20th century wasn't the atom bomb. It was consumer capitalism.
It leaves us with a provocative, almost unsettling thought for the future. We look back at the Pepsi-Soviet barter deals as a bizarre historical anomaly, right? A funny story about submarines and soda.
But consider our modern world for a moment. Our entire global economy is utterly dependent on highly complex, hyper-fragile, just-in-time supply chains and fiat currencies that rely entirely on digital trust and server farms.
If those digital systems were to suddenly fracture today, if a massive cyber attack or a geopolitical crisis wiped out trust in the dollar or the euro, what bizarre, archaic barter systems would the world's current tech monopolies be forced to invent just to survive?
If traditional currencies failed, could we see a future where a massive software giant doesn't just trade user data, but ends up demanding physical resources, raw minerals, or even owning physical sovereign territory just to keep their data centers running?
It is a question that proves a profound point. The physical mechanisms of survival, logistics, and power are constantly evolving, but the underlying human desperation to maintain the illusion of value remains remarkably constant. Thank you for giving us your time and your attention today.
If you found this exhaustive exploration valuable, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel.
Check the description below for reference links and more information on all the historical sources we discussed.
Until next time, keep elevating your mind.
ALEATORY podcast.